honored to introduce pioneering voice on peace building. Professor Roger McGinty is professor at Durham Global Security Institute and the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. He co-founded the Everyday Peace Indicators. He is the International Studies Association Peace Studies Section Distinguished Scholar for 2025, and his 2021 book, Everyday Peace, How So-Called Ordinary People Can Disrupt Violent Conflict, published by Oxford University Press, won the prestigious 2025-2022 Ernst Otto Xempiel Award for the best book on peace. So I have the honor and the privilege to give the floor to Professor Roger McGinty.
So I'm really honored to be in a room with so many practitioners, so many people who are thinking and working on peace. And I think, like everyone else, I'm still trying to work out what our peace landscape looks like. 2 nights ago in Northern Ireland, where I live, I went to get a haircut. As you can imagine, it was a very short experience. But I was chatting to the man who was cutting my hair, and, you know, a barber, it's in the law, it's in the constitution of everyone who cuts your hair. They ask you, "Oh, are you going anywhere nice?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to Bologna." "Oh, Bologna, what are you doing there?" And I said, "Oh, well, you know, I'm going to talk about the changing peace landscape." And we got chatting. And, you know, invariably we talked about Ukraine, we talked about Trump, we talked about things that were happening in the world. And I said to him, "What would you call the international situation at the minute? How would you characterize it?" And he thought for a moment, and he said, "Roger, it's a shit show." So here I am talking to you about this topic. And I want to organize this in 4 ways, on 4 themes. The main one being fragmentation. The fragmentation of the existing peace system. And then we have new actors emerging. But as we'll see, they aren't quite new. And we have old and new actors coming together to create a hybrid system of peace. And then we have the promise of peace tech. But let's get something out of the way first. And that is, let's not blame Trump for everything. He is at the pinnacle of the attention economy, and what he wants is for all of us to talk about him at all times in all forums. Let's blame him for the things that he is responsible for, and there is a lot. But actually, the key trends in the peace system predate Trump. He's part of it, he's a disruptor, but there are many other disruptors as well. So let's start with the first of these 4 trends, and that's the fragmentation of the rules-based international order. And the preliminary thing to say is that, of course, this rules-based international order worked for some people, and it didn't work for others. And one thing that I've noticed in quite a few forums is a romanticization of that rules-based international order. And let's remember that actually that meant war for a lot of people. That meant displacement for a lot of people. It worked for some on the planet, but it didn't work for others. But what we've seen is a very significant fatigue amongst liberal peace actors. Those actors that talked about peace in the last years of the last century and the first decade of this century no longer talk about peace. They no longer invest as much in peace. And certainly they have looked at the investments that they've made in terms of blood and treasure in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Liberia, Cambodia, and they've seen very poor returns for their money, for their effort. So there's no appetite for boots on the ground. There's no appetite for the peace support or peace interventions that we've seen decades ago. We've seen the rise of alternative non-Western peacemakers, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. And crucially, we've seen liberal peace actors leave the field of peacemaking. We've seen those actors that invested heavily in terms of energy, in terms of words, in terms of resources into peace. We've seen them leave the field. And of course, nature dislikes a vacuum. And vacuums are going to be filled by other actors. And also, we see the greater prominence of seemingly insurmountable obstacles or challenges. We see environmental issues. And of course, we're all still flying. We see migration. Increasingly, it's termed as a threat. We see stagflation, reasonably high levels of inflation and low levels of growth. We see demographic challenges with countries, in a sense, in a Malthusian sense, not replenishing their own population. And few people seem to have an answer to these issues. And crucially, what is absent from so many European and other capitals is optimism, is a sense that change can be mastered, that change can be directed for the public good. If you look at European leaders at the moment, frankly, most of them are in a prone position. They're in the brace position. They're managing decline. Contrast that with the last years of the last century and the first decade of this century, in which, whether we liked it or not, there was a can-do attitude amongst Western leaders. There was an attitude that challenges were to be met and overcome. That liberal optimism is no longer there. And don't mistake this for a nostalgia for the liberal peace, but that can-do attitude does not seem to be there anymore. And that has filtered into the peace landscape and organisations that are working for peace. So just to continue on this theme of fragmentation of the peace order, we've seen the deliberate sidelining of the United Nations. The United Nations is simply the sum of its parts. And if leading states do not want the UN to have a prominent position, they work for that goal. And they have been working for that goal. Perhaps most of us in this room have to think for a second or two to recall the name of the UN Secretary General. In past eras, we didn't have to do that. The name was on the tips of our tongue. We have no new peacekeeping operations. In fact, we've got a decline in the number of UN peacekeeping operations. We've seen the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization. I mean, think of that. Just a few years after the pandemic, and a key lesson of the pandemic was we needed joined up health monitoring systems. The US withdraws from it. But let's not blame this decline solely on the US. Last month, Poland and the Baltic states withdrew from the Ottawa Treaty. This was a treaty that bans landmines, anti-personnel landmines. So members of the European Union are also undermining this rules-based international order. So we're seeing processes of deglobalization, of tariffs, of nativism, of nationalism on the rise. We see the securitization of everything. So challenges and problems are securitized, they're weaponized, they're seen through a security lens. And we can see this before our eyes by speeches by European leaders in which they talk about shifting their economies to a war footing, in which we can see quite directly aid budgets being looted for defence purposes. Now, last summer I interviewed 30 senior peacemakers, mediators. These were people who had worked in multiple contexts, at least for 2 decades. And I asked them one question. I said, in your experience of being a mediator, of peacemaking, what works? And they told me what didn't work. And I said, no. What works? And they continued to talk about what didn't work. And on the third attempt, they usually said what worked. But it was a really revealing exercise, and many did talk about this fragmentation of the international rules-based order. One said following the standard liberal peace recipe in Iraq, or following the standard liberal peace recipe in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't work. Setting up shell governments in Iraq and South Sudan does not work. Another said a version of a liberal-looking state seemed to be the end goal. Now that doesn't seem to be viable. So what is it you're trying to build? And that's a really good question for everyone in this room. If it's not state building, what is it that peace is trying to build? If it's going beyond the state, then what is it trying to build? And is it possible to have peace without that minimal level of security that well-functioning states should protect? Another said the big change is the decline of Western powers and their economic and military power in comparison to others. 20 years ago, we did not have the active engagement of Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf countries. There was a framework for resolution. We have no framework. The West is not a predominant political and military power anymore. There are lots of other powerful actors asserting themselves in the conflicts we work in. This was actually really interesting. There is, in a sense, a market for mediation out there, and conflict actors realize that. So they go mediator shopping. Which mediator will listen to them better? Which will give them, in a sense, the best deal? But of course, too many mediators can spoil the broth. It leads to an extremely complex situation. Rather than 2 conflict actors and 1 mediator, we might have multiple conflict actors and multiple mediators. So it's a very dynamic situation. And another said African countries are fed up with Western peacemaking. There is this binary of the West and the rest doesn't want to play the game anymore. So this brings us on to the alternative peacemakers. And there's an immediate issue here, and that is, what do we call them? And I'm talking about Turkey and Gulf countries and China and Brazil. Do we call them non-Western or non-traditional or global South or alternative or new? And no matter what term we use, it seems to center us, the West. So it speaks to a wider issue, and that is our epistemology or ontology that centers us as, in a sense, the owners of peace, as the people who can speak on and about peace with authority. So we see United Arab Emirates. Prisoner swaps between Russia and Ukraine take place on an almost industrial scale. We're talking high hundreds being exchanged every month. And it's the UAE who does that. They do it on a systematic basis. And we tend not to hear about it. Qatar worked on child repatriation in the same war. We know about Israel. Sorry, I'm not making a point by not capitalizing Israel. I've just noticed that is simply a spelling mistake on my part. We see Qatar working in relation to Israel, Hamas. We see Oman working in relation to the US and Iran. Brazil and China came up with a peace plan for Ukraine. We saw 2 summers ago an African peace mission to Moscow and Kyiv, and it was quite interesting, the media commentary on that African peace mission, in which a number of African leaders travelled together with a peace plan. And the commentary in the Western news sites was very snooty, was very condescending. I said, what do these Africans know? They know nothing about the context. They've got enough problems in their own backyard. They should look in their own backyard before trying to solve other problems. They're trying to distract attention from national problems. This is simply a photo opportunity and an ego trip. And I read those criticisms and I thought, well, those are exactly the same things that people said about European mediators in the former Yugoslavia and in many other contexts. But the key point is that the world of mediation, the world of peacemaking, is shifting eastwards. It's shifting away from those traditional places. I'm not saying it's shifting completely. There's lots and lots of good work, good people, good organizations working in Europe and North America and elsewhere. But there is this shift, and I'm not quite sure that everybody gets it. And much of this mediation is very passive. They wait until they're asked. They do it very quietly. And it also has a passive time scale. In other words, they're not beholden to the deadline. They're not beholden to the budget or the project cycle. And also, and this is a key question facing, I think, many of us in this room, often there is no discernible normative or ideological baggage associated with this peacemaking and mediation. A criticism made of Western peacemaking was that it came with conditions. Oh, you want to talk about rights for women? Oh, you want democracy? You want a constitution with rights built in? You want a wider peace process? And this really poses a huge challenge for us in this room. Are we prepared to countenance peacemaking that doesn't involve women? Are we prepared to countenance peacemaking that does not have elements of rights, that does not talk about democratization? And like any tortured liberal, there are no right answers to these questions. Our fate is to continue to be tortured liberals. That's, what we signed up for, probably, if you're in this room. So I think there are 4 pressing questions for these alternative peacemakers. And again, I'm uncomfortable with this term alternative or new or non-traditional or non-Western. Happy to consider other terms. First question, is there a plan beyond humanitarianism? Many of these actions save and improve lives. That's crucially important. Who can complain and criticize peacemaking that saves and improves lives? If you are a prisoner, if you've been extraordinarily lucky in the Russian-Ukraine war and you have survived and been taken prisoner and have not been summarily executed, which happens in all wars with immense frequency, who can complain? That person can go on and hopefully have a productive life. But is this peacemaking from Gulf countries, from other countries? Does it involve anything beyond that humanitarian moment, that humanitarian event? Do these initiatives ever expand to become peace processes? Something broader that actually wants to move beyond the humanitarian moment to think about a peace plan and a peace process that perhaps is participatory, that involves a new political dispensation, a political dispensation that goes some way to managing the root cause of the conflict. And in this peacemaking, what is the role for rights and emancipation? Is there space for women? Is there space for young people? Is there space for minorities? And also, is this a system that we're seeing emerging? Or is it simply, is it like freestyle jazz, in which every instrument is playing on its own? And at some stage with freestyle jazz, you listen to it for the first 2 minutes on the radio and you think, oh, that's quite interesting. By minute 4, you think it's some sort of CIA torture technique and you need to turn it off because it's just, ear-splitting and hurtful. So is this joined up? Can we call it a system? Or is it everyone doing their own thing? And then the third of these trends, we're seeing a hybrid system. Not so much hybrid in the sense of two coming together to form one, but a peace space that is populated by multiple actors working side by side. We see an old or established peace system and an emerging peace system occupying the same space. And the question is, can they collaborate? Can they cooperate? Can they work together? Can they bring complementary things to the table? Can they work well together with their individual skill sets? Or are we seeing competition? And competition that is non-productive. As I said earlier, we can see some mediator shopping. So this is very much a work in progress. It's dynamic, and the sketch that I've given of this emerging system is by no means comprehensive. And then peace tech, and I'm aware peace tech is a subject of today. I'm aware there are peace techers in the room, but there is a question. Is this Tech Bros for Peace, or is it a genuine addition to the peace building toolkit? Sure, there are opportunities with peace tech, but there are also challenges. And possibly many of us are somewhere between being peace tech boosters. Yeah, we all love new shiny things. Bring us to the new shiny thing. But many of us have skepticism as well. This era, this generation of people interested in peace is truly blessed. We have never had so much data on peace and conflict at our fingertips. Every time I look, I see a new data set. I see new visualizations. I see the harnessing of data, bringing various data sets together to tell the story of peace and conflict more effectively. But it's worth asking questions about data. And I published something a couple of months ago with Pamina Fershau, in which we referred to the data myth. And there is a sense, I think, at the moment, and it's a real challenge for many of us in this room, that somehow we can data our way out of conflict. We haven't dated our way out of Sudan, the conflict in Sudan. And I don't think no matter how much data we have, we will data our way out of that conflict. It involves two sets of leaders who are arguing over power. As simple as that. It is obviously more complex. But the data myth to me is the fetishization of certain aspects of data. The fetishization that if we have enough objective data, then we can rationally solve conflict. Well, I'm sorry, but in conflict situations, it's very difficult to find objective data. Data becomes another resource that is fought over. And if only we have more data, and donors and funders always ask for more data. Well, frankly, how much data do you want? Because every time I look, there is more and more and more data. It becomes this addiction. And only if we have faster data, and with technology, we can have not only real-time data, but we can have future data. We have predictive data through AI. So we've got faster and faster, and we can see organizations, in a sense, engaged in a peace tech arms race to get more and faster data. And we have to ask ourselves, is this actually contributing to peace? Oh dear, I might have unmasked myself as a bit of a skeptic. But I'm not really. I remain to be convinced, and I'm certainly open to this. And I've got a number of questions. And in case anyone from the peace tech booster end of things feels picked upon, these questions apply to the entire peace building community, not just peace tech. And the first is, where's the motive force behind this? Is it demand-led or supply-led? Are people in Yemen or Myanmar or or Sudan or many other conflict-afflicted places sitting there thinking, if only peace tech or non-tech peace builders come and save us? Well, frankly, most of them are getting on with their lives as best they can. So is this supply-led or demand-led? Is it the case that we have the technology and can do amazing things? Or is it there is a real demand here? What's the added value in terms of saving and improving lives? Can peace building go beyond the low-hanging fruit, the easy projects, to actually save and improve lives? That, to me, is the core mission. Is it emancipatory, or does it reinforce existing power hierarchies? And remember, these questions are for the entire peace-building community, not just peace tech. And can it complement other more human approaches to peace? Can it complement, and I say this with an emphasis on peace being about relationships, peace being about social harmony, peace being about societies finding their own level, societies finding ways of working, of getting the kids to school, of getting food onto the table. So, to conclude, and from the quotations from the interviews I carried out last summer, one person said, there's disagreement on the ambition of what peace is. It's increasingly diverse and complicated. So do we actually know what this peace thing is that we're trying to achieve? And one person said, conflict actors are working hard to avoid being cornered into peace negotiations, certainly of the type we had in the 1990s. The contemporary international environment gives them resources. And when I think about it, much of the vernacular, much of the practices of peace building come from that moment of the 1990s and the first decade of this century. And we have to ask ourselves if the peace building playbook that we have at the moment has actually been updated enough, if it is fit for purpose for a different era. Are we using a toolkit that was fit for purpose a generation ago? Have we got, in a sense, the right toolkit for the changing nature of conflict? So, where now for peace? Well, can the different, like a coward, I'm going to end with questions, and In my own defense, I think this situation is just so dynamic that it's very difficult to conclude in a definitive way. But let's ask ourselves, can these different actors work together? Can we find these peace coalitions that will be effective, that will involve old and apparently new, Western and non-Western, event-based and process-based? Can peace mean anything more than humanitarianism? We seem to be in an era in which emancipation, rights, democracy seems quite unpopular. Do look at the speeches given by people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and think of them what you like, but at least they did talk about human rights and democracy. Look at speeches by world leaders at the moment. They don't talk about democracy and they don't talk about human rights. They talk about security. And finally, is this era of peace processes over? Are we in this peace process era? The last major peace accord was Colombia in 2016. So is it worth recalibrating our thinking about peace? Perhaps we have to become much more dynamic, much more nimble. We have to leave behind that playbook from 1992 on the agenda for peace, and we need to update that. I know there is, from the UN, a new agenda for peace, but maybe we need an even more updated one. Let me leave it there. We're all trying to work this out, but thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks indeed, Professor McGinty, for his inspiring speech. It's clear that the situation is dynamic. The initial anecdote about the barber made me think that the last time I got a haircut, it was, as you can imagine, several years ago. And there was the impression at the time that democracy, that human rights, that peace was actually a positive thing, even among barbers in conversations we had there. Whereas now it's possibly no longer like that. And maybe the cultural consensus on principles like democracy, human rights, and especially peace makes now a difference on how things are going and explains why there is now a shift to alternative peacemakers. So, it's a bit awkward now to introduce a session of questions and answers because Professor McGinty surprised us with a long list of questions that are very thought-provoking. It's a lot of food for thought. So I hope that they will inspire also speakers to try to give a response to this long list of very difficult questions. Our volunteers here have the time to get a couple of questions. So if you want to intervene, please raise your hand and try to be concise so that we can give the floor to as many people as possible. Dr.
Hi, thank you. I'm Evelyn Pauls. I'm with AP and the Berker Foundation. On this question of, is peace now anything beyond humanitarianism? And in Selina's spirit, to ask maybe a little bit more bold questions. What would you say to the idea that maybe the aim has been and still is just to create stability? And this whole packaging of human rights and emancipatory rhetoric that we've seen in the 90s and the 2000s was kind of just a cover-up for just, you know, creating allies or supporting systems in particular places that would sustain the economic interests of the US, Europe, etc. And maybe now it's actually not so different. And what these new or alternative or whatever actors are doing is kind of the same. And they're just not packaging it in this normative rhetoric on top of it. So yeah, just putting that there. Thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you, Roger, for the inspiring presentation and thought-provoking as always. And I one thing you didn't really talk much about is the international order, the multilateral international order. You simply said, well, the United Nations is the sum of its parts, when clearly the case right now. And but until not too long ago, there was a thin rule-based international order that actually played a role in limiting the excesses of violence and force. And it looks like that thin rule-based international order is gone. And I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on that, and whether, let me say one quick additional point. If it is gone, it's because probably it didn't really work out very well. So there were good reasons, because it has been replaced by a new system, and this hybrid system with a mix of actors and so on and so forth. But the question I have is, it is, at least to my mind, hard to think of a world of moving towards peace processes without some sense of multilateral order and minimally agreed upon rules. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about this. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was a really enlightening talk. I'm Sakshi. I come from India, so I'm going to talk about what's happening right now, obviously. So active live conflict and the role of alternative peace actors particularly. And I don't know where I stand on it really, so I was looking for, I guess, some inspiration. It's actually really hard being here right now talking about all this, where there's active war maybe about to happen between two nuclear states. But what I guess my question is, so at the moment, after the terrorist attack happened in Kashmir, there was a lot of talk about how the international community didn't really get engaged or involved, and whether it should have. And now that it's escalated to actual military conflict and could potentially escalate more, who should get involved? And as we speak, the external ministers, foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia and Iran have just landed in Delhi. So in terms from a mediation perspective, and I don't know where that will go, but it does bring to, I guess, the fore, like, where's the role of the UN versus, the traditional humanitarian peacemakers versus the Middle East kind of rising up. And at this point, I would say anything, whatever works to kind of mediate it.
Thank you very much. My name is Francesco. I work for the United Nations. So many questions that I would actually have, really interesting. By the way you actually explain and detail this, allow me to say, shit show, as the barber said. There's one question that I will choose because I think somebody else asked already about the United Nations. What is the role in all of this? I think we are a little bit like, this is something that I would like to listen about the role of corporations, especially in the new peace building, especially when we talk about tech. Because one of the reasons why states might be a little bit less interesting is because factually they are actually losing authorities. And if you look at some of this, I mean, needless to say, when the new US administration was actually inaugurated, we know who was sitting there in the first line, right? It was quite clear. And if you look at Meta, Facebook, and all these companies, Amazon too, we are starting to have, well, they have always had for a long time public affairs positions, including here in Italy, okay, trying to influence the decision-making system. And we are not talking about it. It's happening. It's happening with Airbnb, for example. And I see a big role they could actually, drones, for example. There are so many interesting things there. And I think it's important that here we talk about that as well, because they might be the ones that set the agenda in the future if they are not already doing so. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Asma. I'm from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. I have a very short question, and I think just really building on your point about the last so-called comprehensive area of peace processes and peace agreements and so forth. And again, addressing the issue of the normative approaches and being more pragmatic and looking at, rather than principle-based peacemaking and humanitarianism, to more pragmatic transactional agreement, is whether we're really moving back to the concept of negative peace rather than really looking at positive aspect, especially with narratives looking at silencing the gun, if you wish, with de-escalation and ceasefire, rather than really looking into long-term and lasting and just peace approaches. So just really interested in your thought about that.
Thank you very much. My name is Banem. I'm working for the UN. It's a little bit difficult to talk about peacekeeping without talking about the UN. That's why I'm coming here to ask this question. You know, in some ways, the UN system has been considered for a long time now as a useless thing, because in terms of peacekeeping. And I don't know whether the system within the UN is not conducive to that. What do you think about the veto system that normally, you know, should, you know, is rather conducive to violence rather than peace within the UN? Do we think that the actual configuration of the UN is conducive to peace or to violence? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, and thank you to you who has walked about. You've got your 10,000 steps, so good work. Really good questions, really big questions. Okay. Basically, the question was the liberal peace of a generation ago, in a sense, covered or camouflaged by a verbiage of human rights, emancipation, etc., and they didn't really mean it. To a certain extent, yes, there was a large amount of peace washing, but at the same time, and this applies to a number of the questions, lives were saved and lives were improved. I think back to the days in which there were newspapers, and I remember reading one, and in a tiny little article, really about that size, it said that the 1 millionth refugee stroke IDP displaced person had been returned in the former Yugoslavia. That was remarkable. That was a massive change, and that did show an international system working. But I agree with you that much of the language was simply camouflage, or it was said but not followed up. Think about all of those reconciliation or truth recovery elements in peace accords, and they very rarely were delivered. And then the question extended, well, when we look at these so-called new or alternative peacemakers, are we talking about more of the same? In a sense, are they being honest by saying, you know, in a sense, are they Ryanair and saying, you know, we're going to give you a dreadful customer service, but at least we're going to get you from A to B. You know, we're going to be honest. We're terrible. We hate you as passengers, but we're usually on time. In a way, I think this mode of peacemaking from Gulf states and others is actually different qualitatively. Different attitudes in terms of time, different attitudes in terms of what can be done, but also a can-do attitude, an optimism that is absent from Western peacemaking. Roberto, your very good question on what now for multilateralism. And I think what we're seeing is a hybrid. We've got the remnants of multilateralism, but we've also got new multilateralism, this transactional multilateralism that is emerging. We have this hybrid system. There is a recognition among some that actually we do need the UN. We do need these spaces where actors can get together, actors can have those conversations. I am very worried what the Trump administration will do to the UN. It already has defunded and some aspects of the UN and its agencies and withdrawn from others. So I think that is quite serious. But I think what we have to do and what states are doing is navigating through this landscape of a new emerging multilateralism, which often is very transactional and often is not universal. It operates on a regional basis. It operates on a thematic or event, conflict-related basis. But if we didn't have the UN, let's be very clear, we would need to reinvent it. Unfortunately, the UN came out of a catastrophe, came out of World War II, and let's hope whatever comes next doesn't come out of a catastrophe. Yes, I may be missing some questions, so apologies on that. My note-taking is quite poor. Francesco, you asked about the role of corporations. I think a major conflict for the 21st century will have three actors, and that is the conflict over data. And the three actors are individuals, governments, and corporations. And what we've seen in the United States, at least, but also in other polities, how governments have caved very quickly in face of large corporations who harvest our data, who own our data, and who see us as data. And when you think about the social contract says that we give some of our rights and loyalty to the state if the state protects us. But if the state fails to protect us, if the state does not protect our data, and if the state does not give us things, why should we give it any loyalty? Why should we pay taxes to it? And I think this is a key conflict that we're going to see over this century. But it will require some sort of fight back from governments and from individuals. At the minute, it's 1-0 to corporations. So this one is to be watched. In terms of India, Pakistan, and it was such good news to wake up that two nuclear-armed countries have decided to initiate military action against one another. But who should become involved? Well, both are members of the United Nations. Both. Yes, they are members of the United Nations. So the system is there. Whether they want to use it or not is very much up to them. It's very noticeable that despite both being large countries, both being powerful countries, particularly India with its booming economy, they still look for top cover from either the United States or China. And that to me is quite interesting, that these states probably wouldn't act unless they had a secret phone call to a large White House saying, be warned, this is going to happen. Quite interesting, and this gets to a question of the United Nations and its structures. Would India actually want a seat on a UN Security Council? Why would it actually want that? Because that brings responsibility. It's actually quite content to be the biggest fish in its regional pond. Why would it want to join a already dysfunctional UN Security Council? So I think it's probably quite happy to be the regional power without invoking the UN. And if the UN, of course, was functional, if it was working well, then it may want to join. So it's a long-winded way of answering the question of whether the UN is a peace-supporting or, in a sense, conflict-reinforcing organization. Well, there are different UNs, and there are different parts of the UN. quite clearly the Security Council, which is based on a World War II outcome, is completely dysfunctional, but it will not change. Those states who have power will not, like turkeys, vote for Christmas. But the United Nations saves and improves lives. Its agencies save and improve lives. And I have little doubt about that. And then there was a question about negative peace and whether the peace system is reinforcing negative peace. Yes, in many cases, but I think we are too under-celebratory of negative peace. I suggest that very often we should give 2 cheers for negative peace. If you're coming from a situation of displacement, if you're coming from a situation of death and destruction, then you'll grab negative peace before a positive peace. I've never seen this peace of unicorns and rainbows where everything is lovely. And I'm not entirely sure that neoliberalism will ever allow that world of unicorns and rainbows. We will always live in a world of inequality, of shortage. And, isn't it crazy as human beings we have to work for a living? Surely there should be a better way of spending our time. But that is the human reality. That is how we've constructed society. So possibly negative peace in some form of social democratic format is the best we can hope for. I think that has answered all of the questions, but I apologize if I've missed any. And let me finish this round of answers, or possibly all of the answers, by saying I don't think we should be too negative. We do have a peace system. We do have huge numbers of people working for peace, both in NGOs, INGOs, but also in communities. I think there's a sense that we overlook the biggest cohort of peacemakers on the planet. And those are moms and dads and aunties and youth workers and people who give each of us our moral code. The biggest peace movement on the planet is around everybody's kitchen table or dining room table, because that's where we learn about politics, and that's where we get our moral code. And I think one of the great fictions of our time is that we believe political parties are more important than they are, and political leaders are more important than they are. It's actually individuals, communities, and families that are the largest and most successful peace organizations on our planet. And they're also the funniest as well.